Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. We are starting a new year in January of 2021. We're going to hope that the coming year is better for us than that in the past. But today I've got some things to talk about and to demonstrate that I think are going to be important things to keep in mind based on some of the stuff that we've been seeing going on in society around us in the wake of everything that went on in 2021. All right, so what are we talking about today? Well, a lot of the times people coming out of Mormonism, if you're new to the channel, a lot of what we talk about here is kind of the details of what happens as people start to move beyond the religious paradigm of Mormonism. You'll be exposed to a bunch of different discussions, different concepts, different ideas. One of the first Probably in the first year of coming out, I watched this movie that I had never heard of called The Wave. And it's about a high school teacher that runs a bit of a social experiment in his history class around the question of, well, how in the world did people who were Germans in Germany prior to World War II, how did they go along with the Nazis as they rose to power? And not only that, but then in the wake of the end of World War II, after the Holocaust, after all of the atrocities had been exposed, a lot of the Germans said, we had no idea that was happening. We had no part of that. And for a long time, people in the world kind of looked at the German population a little bit differently because they're the one place where they allowed these atrocities to rise. And the high school teacher, his name was Ron Jones, spent some time thinking about that and then ran an experiment in the hope of giving students some insight into the power of movements like that. And it was very interesting. We're going to go into that. But before we do that, as I was researching this, I learned that the PBS children's television show Arthur actually did a little microcosm of that in a way to kind of expose young children to some of these themes very early on in a context that they could understand. And so I found that episode and I watched it and I thought it was just a really good way to segue into this question, because underlying all of our discussion today is really going to be the idea of getting out of the paradigm of looking at coercive groups or cults from the lens of, well, let's examine what that group does. What is that teaching that group did? Because you can look at all sorts of terrible examples. You can look at Jonestown, where they committed mass suicide, and you can go back and look at all the different things that Jim Jones taught them and compelled them to do, which led to that suicide. But how does that prepare you then for looking at a totally different group like Scientology, where they didn't go to mass suicide? And if you get hung up on the specific teachings and actions of a particular group, then it doesn't necessarily prepare you for some future group you may encounter that takes a totally different approach. And what I hope to have happen is at the end of today's discussion, you'll be able to look back on the examples that are given and understand that it's not really by looking at the group and what they do that helps you prepare for the future or understand what's going on. It's really by examining what human vulnerabilities that each of us carries in our mind, in our heart, in the nature of our social connections with other people, with families. There are vulnerabilities there that tend to get exploited over and over again in these coercive situations. And it's really by understanding those vulnerabilities, being able to detect when those vulnerabilities are being exploited to distort your perceptions and your values, and seeing that in whatever group happens in the future, it may look something totally different, but understanding those vulnerabilities is really what's really going to help you kind of see what's going on and try to steer clear of that type of force. So without further ado, let's take a look at this Arthur episode from PBS called The Pride of Lakewood. Now, what I've done is I've gone in and I have kind of cleaned it up and tightened it up so we can just look at the episode itself. I'll pause it a few times if there's any commentary needed. And so let's get started. You're going to start out the episode and we're going to see Francine, one of the characters, having lost a race. And we're going to discuss what goes on from there. So let's get going.
The Pride of Lakewood. How did we lose that track meet? We're much faster than they are.
It was these uniforms. Look. This elastic is broken. There are holes in my shirt.
For new ones, Principal Haney says we can't afford them.
Well, I need to talk to him.
Well, what'd he say?
He said Yes! We're getting new uniforms!
No way! How did you convince them?
I just said we felt embarrassed in our old ones, and I wanted to take more pride in this school.
Ooh, that's good. You played the guilt card.
No, I didn't. I meant it. Lakewood Elementary's a great school. We should take more pride in it.
You're right. We don't even have a school song.
Or a pep squad. I'd be such a good captain.
We should have both of those things. Ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare this the first meeting of the Lakewood Pride Committee.
Okay, so let's pause it right there. So to recap, they discovered something that was wrong, something that needed to be fixing. Specifically, their school uniforms were cruddy and the school didn't seem to be taking care of it. So they did something to make a difference. And they immediately got that rush of good feeling that they were, stepping up and taking action for something that they felt was wrong in the world. And it gave them a sense of purpose. And so these kids then decide that they want to share that sensation and move forward in being activists for this cause. And they spend some time trying to get other people supporting it. I edited it out here because it doesn't really contribute to everything, but they end up getting Buster, who is a little bit more appealing to the broader school because he's not a brainiac. He's just kind of a everyday kind of guy. There's nothing too remarkable about him. And so he can appeal to more people. And so that's kind of how they move forward for this. But it starts out with something that is genuinely good. What they're doing is good. They're improving their community and they're trying to take pride in their local environment. So let's keep going.
Hi, everyone. I'm Buster Baxter, and I'm president of the LPC because I love Lakewood Elementary. In fact, I love this whole room and everyone in it. Does anyone else think this is the best school in Elwood City?
I guess. It's pretty good.
Then don't be afraid to say it out loud. I love Lakewood.
Lakewood.
Louder!
I love Lakewood!
I love Lakewood!
This school's a great school. This school's a cool school. From our gymnasium to the library footstools.
From our beautiful art room
To the Lakewood parking lot. This school is great for you and me.
That was great. Give yourselves a pat on the back. Now, LPC member Arthur Reed has an announcement.
There's a new salute. Just make an L with your thumb and forefinger and say ILL. That stands for I love Lakewood. Let's try it. ILL. 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 ILL.
Excuse me, can I get by, please? I'm trying to get to class.
Hey, you're not wearing your button.
That's because I don't have one. I'm not a member.
All right, so they've done a really good job here of showing how the energy that comes from being part of a community, being part of a group, showing pride in something. They've identified something bad in the world, which is apathy towards your school, not caring about your school. And the inversion of that is really caring about your school, wanting to do things, showing pride. And so all of the students can then be good and see themselves as good and see themselves as a vibrant, helpful part of the community, a positive force by joining this group. And not only that, but now there's cultural things that you can do to show your membership in the group. And they take that in the form of the hand salute for ILL, I love Lakewood, as well as the pins that they're wearing. All of these things serve to identify those people who have stepped forward and identified themselves with the group so that they are part of the in crowd. Now, keep in mind that all of the messaging that has been done to this point to get people inclusive in the community has been positive. It's been centered around love, around care and concern for your community. All of these things are good ideals, but now they're being interwoven into the social forces that all of us have in our brains. We've evolved as social creatures who derive value from being part of a community and the benefit that that can offer us, but it can get distorted and work against what we may hold otherwise as significant values. And that's where this story is going to go. Now, we've already seen, I don't know if you picked up on a little bit of it. If you're familiar with Arthur, there's this character called the Brain, who's kind of, he's the smart kid. And while everyone was singing, he didn't really sing, and he seemed to be looking a little bit concerned. And then you have this other young girl who is a little bit different from everyone else. She's a little bit different animals. Her hair, dress is a little bit different. And she's not interested in joining the group. And now we've already gotten an insight into what's happening because we're starting to see group dynamics that look at us versus them, in group versus out group. And remember, a lot of these people are close friends and got along perfectly fine with each other, didn't see each other as less than or wrong or bad before the construct of this Lakewood Pride Committee appeared and created a division between the people that now places some people as good and some people as bad by either adopting or rejecting the group. So let's keep going because this is getting good. All right, so let's move this back here. Boop. And here we go.
Whew. At least there's one other kid who's not wearing one of those things.
It's just a meaningless fad. I'm sure it'll be over soon.
Hi, guys. Want a free watch? It's yours if you sign up for a lifetime membership with the LPC.
Yeah, they tell perfect time. Oh, look at that! Mine's saying it's time for you two to join up.
You know what? I'm not hungry anymore.
Me neither.
Now, what just took place there was actually pretty significant. If you know anything about the show, Binky Barnes, that kind of bigger bulldog bully looking kind of kid, he's not the smartest, he's not the brightest, and a lot of the times he's not really included in a lot of different things because he's kind of abrasive. But in the context of this group, suddenly he belongs. Not only does he belong, but the fervor with which he advocates for the group elevates him even more. And so he can take some of those innate trends and personality types that he has to be more aggressive and now apply that to the purposes of the group. And he kind of becomes a strong arm for the group. So in the class, the characters there see that there's some holdouts. There's some people who aren't wearing a pin. And so if you don't become part of the group, now the people who are in the group see them not just as rejecting the group, but rejecting the morals of the group. They can't possibly want what's good for the school if they're not in the group, because of course you have to be in the group and wear the slogan and make the hand sign if you want to be in the group. And if you don't, then you reject those things. Now, the Brain and this other character don't want to have anything to do with it. But what's remarkable is rather than argue with Binky and the other character, I forget her name, they simply remove themselves from it. And there's actually a great deal of wisdom from that. But if you understand how mob mentality works, how group social movements work, having that type of argument when you're surrounded by a bunch of people who are all single-mindedly in the thrall of this kind of ideology, because it is a form of ideology even in this group. They've created a system of ideas about what it means to be good, and it's really powerful. And for one person to stand up against that is very taxing, and in many cases it can actually be dangerous. So let's keep going. All right.
Doesn't love Lakewood?
I got one too. So did George.
I thought he was a member.
He is, but I heard he didn't cheer loudly enough at the pep rally.
That's it! We have to put a stop to this right...
Shh, get down.
This has gotten way out of hand. What are we going to do?
There's only one person who can stop this. The president.
Okay, so that scene was really powerful and effective because it showed how when you transplant this type of culture onto something that was previously relatively peaceful without these dividing lines of ideology and groupthink, But as soon as you overlay now this dividing line of ideology, the people who are not willing to buy into it have a sense of fear when the majority has adopted that ideology and started to demonize them as outsiders. Now, those of us that are coming out of a manipulative, controlling, coercive religion can probably relate to this, because part of the messaging that we were given growing up is that we are the chosen, we are special, and the world outside of the chosen is misguided, is evil, will try to tear you away. And that same mechanism falls into play. Now, when you're a group holding into that kind of tight ideology that divides people, but you're a minority, well, then the people on the outside aren't really going to fear you all that much. But as we've seen in various chapters of world history and the history of mankind, there are times when these totalistic ideologies become so prevalent that they take over a society, and soon it becomes dangerous not to raise the hand sign, not to pay obeisance by praising or using a slogan or showing the right sign in your window. But what we're seeing in this Pride of Lakewood is a microcosm of the same social forces that play over again and again in history. And the fear that we just saw reflected in the mind and experience of people who were not willing to wear the badge or make the hand sign or join the group actually does take place in the broader world, in our society. When that happens, it's a huge red flag. If you value freedom and diversity of thought, if you value respect for individuals, their lives, their beliefs, and their ideas, and you start to see this type of fear crop up in your society, then you need to look at what are the forces that are causing this fear and try to examine the root of that, because chances are you're going to find a form of ideology very similar to this. It may arise from a good principle and a good notion, but then taken to extreme and added on with black and white thinking of us versus them, good versus bad, turns into a monstrous thing that tears apart societies and ends up having people live in fear. It happens at all different levels. It can happen at the level of a family or a single interpersonal relationship. It can happen in religion. It can happen in politics. It can happen in ways of looking at the world. And we're going to examine some of that in a little bit, but let's keep going.
And tomorrow we will crush the opposition? I don't want to read this. It sounds mean.
Buster, it's our rematch race against Mighty Mountain. We want to make sure the crowd's pumped up.
The president is busy right now, and if this is a reporter, no comment.
I hope that wasn't my mom.
No dice. I can't get past Buster's press secretary.
And Binky's been guarding him round the clock. We'll have to resort to Plan B. You have the letter?
Okay, so in the scene that we just saw, what I really love about it is, if you know the show, you know that Buster the rabbit is really, he's not the brightest, but he's really nice and he's really kind. And his values that you understand watching the show are that he's a good guy and he doesn't really mean anyone any harm. And he's not mean. He's not going to be verbally abrasive or abusive to anyone. But because he's been captured and held prisoner, in a sense, in the ideology, he's surrounded by sycophants and other people who, looking at the world through the lens of us versus them, would immediately demonize him if he were to step away from the group. He's trapped. And they've told him what he needs to say in order to promote the thing. So now the group ideology, the moral framework of the group, has now overcome his own internal moral framework. So that things that he would not normally say about crushing the opposition now become what he has to say in order to uphold the group. Now, if you take these patterns and these principles and ideas and see how they may be implemented in other areas of our lives, you can see that it's a really valuable lesson. So you may love and cherish family members, but if you're given messages and ideas that if they choose something for themselves that's outside of the moral framework of the religious ideology that you've adopted, that they then are broken, or they then cannot receive the full measure of your love and acceptance as they would otherwise receive. Or if you don't raise a hand sign or shout a slogan that you may actually think the opposite of what their moral framework is. So if you don't put the right sign in your window about your community or supporting a particular political group, then you must hate the things that that political group stands for. And so your place of business now may be subject to violence and mob actions. These things just kind of happen. And if all you have to do is turn on your news and take a look at some of the things that happened in the last year in the wake of protests and how different political factions postured themselves and then demanded compliance and demanded outward showing of support, so that you can see how these very human social forces manifest in our modern world. Now, this cartoon is not from 2020, it's from like several years ago. But that's because people understand that these forces exist, and you just have to look out for what is happening in the modern day so you can see how this ideology can take over your environment, your mind, your social media spaces, and cause you to distort your pre-existing values and supplement and override your values with their values. And most of the time it happens invisibly. You accept what they say and you start to internalize it, and so you start to change what you previously held to be important and allow these other things to override it. Most of the time it's not as obvious and stark as what we've seen with Buster here, but it's important to understand that that thing happens so that you can detect it or see it, hopefully, and unplug yourself from that system, because it's a system that does not allow you to hold your own values and priorities if they differ from the ideology of the group. All right, let's keep going.
And what do we want? Victory! All right, and now a few words from our president.
I added in a bit about how you grew up in a small town and your dad was a shoemaker. Just a little color.
No one has the right to tell us we're not proud of our school just because we don't join the right group. That was written by Sue Ellen and Brain, and I agree with them. You can be president. Those are my friends, whether they wear a button or not.
What do we do now?
All right. There's a moment in a lot of these stories where you just kind of get goosebumps and you really appreciate the moral principle there. And Buster crumpling up the deceptive speech that was a form of manipulation that was handed to him, and instead speaking honestly from his heart, from a communication that he got from somebody who he knew was his friend, kind of gave me goosebumps first time I saw that. You see at the start of that scene that the Brain, Sue Ellen, and the moose antelope person, I forget his name, are sitting off to the side. And we know that they're off to the side. They're no longer accepted in their friend group because they refuse to join in the case of Sue Ellen and the Brain. But the moose character, the reason that he's now ostracized is because he didn't sing loud enough. He didn't participate in the group hard enough. And that's a really insightful aspect of this cartoon, is that even people who want to support the group, if they don't do it enough, if they show any degree of compromise, willing to meet people who aren't in the group halfway, well, those people are going to be instantly kicked out of the group anyway. And you can see this type of thing happening in the world around us. Even if you support a particular social movement, if you aren't correct in the way that you support it, you will be seen as an enemy. If you decide to open your ears and listen to differing points of view, then you will be seen as an enemy, because any degree of compromise is seen as complicity. And it serves the purpose of simply amping up the division that happens. Okay, so there were a few comments that I thought were worth reviewing. Spinach says, Binky Barnes equals Porter Walkwell. If you're familiar with Mormon history, you'll know that one of Joseph Smith's childhood friends followed him through all of his different religious activities. His name was Porter Walkwell, and he's notorious for being essentially a violent psychopath. But because he was a violent psychopath in the name of the cause, then he was given a high place of respect and revere within the group. You know, you can look at any of these different chapters of human history in which all of these social forces came to be very prevalent and dominant in society, and invariably you'll find people who are essentially vicious psychopaths because they see a method to promotion, acceptance, and elevation within the group ideology, then they are even more prone to accept the group ideology and to become essentially its strongmen. You know, we saw at the end there that Binky Barnes was the bodyguard for Buster. So he had elevated himself in authority, in position in their little small community by adopting wholeheartedly the ideology and the groupthink. And that's a real force to contend with when you step back and examine how these different things take over entire societies, because they appeal to our normal human impulses to want acceptance, to want other people to give us respect, to want to be included, and to be given power and influence. Those are all very normal, natural human impulses. And when a group does that, then it's going to be even harder to resist its appeal. This cartoon did just such a great job of showing how this can happen in the context of even a school. And for kids who are grade school and elementary school to be exposed to this, I think is really powerful. And it leads us to the next part of our story. So let me stop the screen there. So the next part of our story is something that happened in 1967. This was kind of before the Summer of Love, before the hippie movement took over. And it was something that a high school teacher did that was sort of kept secret for about 10 years. He ran this experiment in his high school classroom. And you'll see at the apex of the experiment, there's a particular reason why after the experiment ran its course, the students didn't really talk about it, because they learned something about themselves that was disturbing, I think, and caused them to really have to grapple with the demons inside of them. This is Ron Jones. He was a first-year history teacher at the Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California in 1967. He had been teaching history and a number of other classes. And when it came down to learning about World War II and the atrocities of the Nazi Party and the Holocaust, the students asked him a question about how in the world that could have happened. How could people deny their complicity in it? How could it have even risen to power? And he engaged in an experiment that turned out to be much more than he had anticipated. That happened in 1967. He subsequently went on, even though he was a very beloved teacher, this really jolted both the school board and the parents. In the years that followed this, he was ousted from his position as a teacher and went on his way as sort of a creative in the area. He continues to live in the San Francisco area today, and he's an author, a playwright, and a performer. And 10 years after that, though, he bumped into one of these students, and it all came rushing back to him. He decided to sit down and write about it. He felt that enough time had passed that he could now write about it, and he gave what was essentially a short story that took about 6 pages to a friend who had connections in television, and it was subsequently purchased and turned into both a television miniseries as well as a novel. It'll be important to realize, and we can talk about it after we go over the next part, the significance of what happened in that classroom to the German people in particular, because it demonstrated that it was not something unique or broken about the German psyche that made them susceptible to the rise of Nazism and Hitler. It was something that lives in all of us, and it's a human vulnerability that can be exploited by charismatic leaders, by compelling ideologies, and then the human psychology just takes over and it starts to amplify in self-reinforcing feedback loops of power, groupthink, tribalism. All of these things play a role in escalating what can happen. And so when this was released as a movie, it was given some awards and became popular. The German school system adopted it as part of their curriculum because it was very informative to how there was nothing inherently broken about Germans, but it was something that they still have to keep guard for. And it was a little bit outdated. So in 2008, because it's kind of like 1960s American high school, German people in 2008 probably can't really relate to it that much. So a filmmaker decided to redo it, and you can find it on, I think, on Amazon Prime in the German language with English subtitles. You can find a revised and updated version that's before the era of smartphones. So if you watch it now, it seems a little bit outdated, but it's really good, and we'll talk about why it's good. But even now, today, in 2017, 2018, and 19, they redid it again. and it's on Netflix. It's called We Are the Wave. And once we get through the next part of this, I want to talk about why the Netflix series is even more powerful and even more informative than what originally happened. But before we get to all that, we're going to go back to the original, and we're going to look at, this is not the made-for-TV movie. This is an audio narration of the original short story. So the words are going to be the words of Ron Jones, that teacher, in his original telling of the story. I've narrated it myself, and I've put some background images. At the first part, you're going to see some pictures of the actual high school and of the teacher himself as he looks today. And then I've used some imagery from the made-for-TV movie just to illustrate the action of what's going on there. And we'll play that as a next chapter in today's episode. So let me go ahead and pull that up. All right, here we go.
For years, I kept a strange secret. I shared the silence with 200 students. Yesterday, I ran into one of those students. For a brief moment, it all rushed back. Steve Caniglio had been a sophomore student in my world history class. We ran into each other quite by accident. It's one of those occasions experienced by teachers when they least expect. You're walking down the street, eating at a secluded restaurant, or buying some underwear, when all of a sudden an ex-student pops up to say hello. In this case, it was Steve running down the street shouting, "Mr. Jones! Mr. Jones!" In an embarrassed hug, we greet. I had to stop for a minute to remember, who is this young man hugging me? He calls me Mr. Jones. He must be a former student. What is his name? In the split second of my race back in time, Steve sensed my questioning and backed up. Then he smiled and slowly raised a hand in a cupped position. My God, he's a member of the third wave. It's Steve Caniglio. He sat in the second row. He was a sensitive and bright student. He played guitar and enjoyed drama. We just stood there exchanging smiles when, without a conscious command, I raised my hand in curved position. The salute was given. Two comrades had met long after the war. The third wave was still alive. Mr. Jones, do you remember the third wave? I sure do. It was one of the most frightening events I ever experienced in a classroom. It was also the genesis of a secret that I and 200 students would sadly share for the rest of our lives. We talked and laughed about the third wave for the next few hours. Then it was time to part. It's strange, you meet a past student in these chance ways. You catch a few moments of your life, hold them tight, then say goodbye, not knowing when and if you'd ever see each other again. Oh, you make promises to call each other, but it won't happen. Steve will continue to grow and change. I will remain an ageless benchmark in his life, a presence that will not change. I'm Mr. Jones. Steve turns and gives a quiet salute, hand raised upward in a shape of a curling wave. A hand curved in a similar fashion, I return the gesture. The third wave. Well, at last it can be talked about. Here, I've met a student and we've talked for hours about this nightmare. The secret must finally be waning. It's taken 3 years. I can tell you and anyone else about the third wave. It's now just a dream, something to remember. No, it's something we tried to forget. That's how it all started. By strange coincidence, I think it was Steve who started the third wave with a question. We were studying Nazi Germany. In the middle of a lecture, I was interrupted by the question. How could the German populace claim ignorance of the slaughter of the Jewish people? How could townspeople, railroad conductors, teachers, doctors claim they knew nothing about concentration camps and human carnage? How can people who were neighbors and maybe even friends of the Jewish citizens say they weren't there when it happened? It was a good question. I didn't know the answer. And as such, as there were several months to go in the school year and I was already at World War II, I decided to take a week and explore the question. Strength through discipline. On Monday, I introduced my sophomore history students to one of the experiences that characterized Nazi Germany: discipline. I lectured about the beauty of discipline, how an athlete feels having worked hard and regularly to be successful at a sport, how a ballet dancer or painter works hard to perfect a movement, the dedicated patience of a scientist in pursuit of an idea. It's discipline, that self-training, control, the power of the will, the exchange of physical hardship for superior mental and physical facilities, the ultimate triumph. To experience the power of discipline, I commanded the class to exercise and to use a new seating posture. I described how proper sitting posture assists mandatory concentration and strengthens the will. In fact, I instructed the class in a sitting posture. This posture started with the feet flat on the floor, hands placed flat across the small of your back to force a straight alignment of the spine. There! Can't you breathe more easily? You're more alert. Don't you feel better? We practiced this new attention posture over and over. I walked up and down the aisles of seated students, pointing out small flaws and making improvements. Proper seating became the most important aspect of learning. I would dismiss the class, allowing them to leave their desks, and then call them back abruptly back to an attention sitting position. In speed drills, the class learned to move from standing position to attention sitting in 15 seconds. In focus drills, I concentrated attention on the feet being parallel and flat, ankles locked, knees bent at 90-degree angles, hands flat and crossed across the back, spine straight, chin down, head forward. We did noise drills in which talking was only allowed to be shown as a distraction. Following minutes of progressive drill assignments, the class would move from standing position outside the room to attention sitting positions at their desk without making a sound. The maneuver took 5 seconds. It was strange how quickly the students took to this uniform code of behavior. I began to wonder just how far they could be pushed. Was this display of obedience a momentary game we were all playing, or was it something else? Was the desire for discipline and uniformity a natural need, a societal instinct we hide within our franchise restaurants and TV programming? I decided to push the tolerance of the class for regimented action. In the final 25 minutes of the class, I introduced some new rules. Students must be sitting in class at the attention position before the late bell. All students must carry pencils and paper for note-taking. When asked or answering a question, the student must stand at the side of their desk. The first word given in answering or asking questions is Mr. Jones. We practiced short, silent reading sessions. Students who responded in a sluggish manner were reprimanded, and in every case made to repeat their behavior until it was a model of punctuality and respect. The intensity of the response became more important than the content. To accentuate this, I requested answers to be given in 3 words or less. The students were rewarded for making an effort at answering or asking questions. They were also acknowledged for doing this in a crisp and attentive manner. Soon everyone in the class began popping up with answers and questions. The involvement level in the class moved from the few who always dominated discussions to the entire class. Even stranger was the gradual improvement in the quality of answers. Everyone seemed to be listening more intently. New people were speaking. Answers started to stretch out as students, usually hesitant to speak, found support for their effort. As for my part in this exercise, I had nothing but questions. Why hadn't I thought of this technique before? The students seemed intent on the assignment and displayed accurate recitation of facts and concepts. They even seemed to be asking better questions and treating each other with more compassion. How could this be? Here I was enacting an authoritarian learning environment, and it seemed very productive. I now began to ponder not just how far this class could be pushed, but how I would change my basic beliefs towards an open classroom and self-directed learning. Was all my belief in Carl Rogers to shrivel and die? Where was this experiment leading? Strength through community. On Tuesday, the second day of the exercise, I entered the classroom to find everyone sitting in silence at the attention position. Some of their faces were relaxed with smiles that come from pleasing the teacher, but most of the students looked straight ahead in earnest concentration, neck muscles rigid, no sign of a smile or a thought or even a question, every fiber strained to perform the deed. To release the tension, I went to the chalkboard and wrote in big letters, "Strength through discipline." Below this, I wrote a second law, "Strength through community." While the class sat in stern silence, I began to talk, lecture, sermonize about the value of community. At this stage of the game, I was debating in my own mind whether to stop the experiment or continue. I hadn't planned such intensity or compliance. In fact, I was surprised to find the ideas on discipline enacted at all. While debating whether to stop or go on with the experiment, I talked on and on about community. I made up stories from my experiences as an athlete, coach, and historian. It was easy. Community is that bond between individuals who work and struggle together. It's raising a barn with your neighbors. It's feeling that you're part of something beyond yourself, a movement, a team, la raza, a cause. It was too late to step back. I can now appreciate why the astronomer turns relentlessly to the telescope. I was probing deeper and deeper into my own perceptions and the motivations for group and individual action. There was much more to see and try to understand. Many questions haunted me. Why did the students accept the authority I was imposing? Where is their curiosity or resistance to this martial behavior? When and how will this end? Following my description of community, I once again told the class that community, like discipline, must be experienced if it is to be understood. To provide an encounter with community, I had the class recite in unison, "Strength through discipline, strength through community." First, I would have 2 students stand and call back our motto, and then add 2 more, until finally the whole class was standing and reciting. It was fun. The students began to look at each other and sense the power of belonging. Everyone was capable and equal. They were doing something together. We worked on this simple act for the entire class period. We would repeat the mottos in rotating chorus, or say them with various degrees of loudness. Always we said them together, emphasizing the proper way to sit, stand, and talk. I began to think of myself as part of the experiment. I enjoyed the unified action demonstrated by the students. It was rewarding to see their satisfaction and excitement to do more. I found it harder and harder to extract myself from the momentum and identity that the class was developing. I was following the group dictate as much as I was directing it. As the class period was ending and without forethought, I created a class salute. It was for class members only. To make the salute, you brought your right hand up towards the right shoulder in a curled position. I called it the third wave salute because the hand resembled a wave about to top over. The idea for 3 came from beach lore, that waves travel in chains, and the third wave being the last and largest of each series. Since we had a salute, I made it a rule to salute all class members outside the classroom. When the bell sounded, ending the period, I asked the class for complete silence. With everyone sitting at attention, I slowly raised my arm with a cupped hand. I saluted. It was a silent signal of recognition. They were something special. Without command, the entire group of students returned the salute. Throughout the next few days, students in the class would exchange this greeting. You would be walking down the hall when all of a sudden 3 classmates would turn your way, each flashing a quick salute. In the library or gym, students would be seen giving this strange hand jive. You would hear a crash of cafeteria food only to have it followed by 2 classmates saluting each other. The mystique of 30 individuals doing this strange gyration soon brought more attention to the class and its experiment into the German personality. Many students outside the class asked if they could join. Strength through action. On Wednesday, I decided to issue membership cards to every student that wanted to continue what I now called the experiment. Not a single student elected to leave the room. In this 3rd day of activity, there were 43 students in the class. 13 students had cut class to be part of the experiment. While the class sat at attention, I gave each person a card. I marked 3 of the cards with a red X and informed the recipients that they had a special assignment to report any students not complying to class rules. I then proceeded to talk about the meaning of action. I explained how discipline and community were meaningless without action. I discussed the beauty of taking full responsibility for one's action, of believing so thoroughly in yourself and your community or family that you will do anything to preserve, protect, and extend that being. I stressed how hard work and allegiance to each other would allow accelerated learning and accomplishment. I reminded students of what it felt like being in classes where competition caused pain and degradation. Situations in which students were pitted against each other in everything from gym to reading. The feeling of never acting, never being a part of something, never supporting each other. At this point, the students stood without prompting and began to give what amounted to testimonials. Mr. Jones, for the first time, I'm learning lots of things. Mr. Jones, why don't you teach like this all the time? I was shocked. Yes, I had been pushing information at them in an extremely controlled setting, but the fact they found it comfortable and acceptable was startling. It was equally disconcerting to realize that complex and time-consuming written homework assignments on German life were being completed and even enlarged on by the students. Performance in academic skill areas was significantly improving. They were learning more, and they seemed to want more. I began to think that the students might do anything I assigned. I decided to find out. To allow students the experience of direct action, I gave each individual a specific verbal assignment. It's your task to design a third wave banner. You are responsible for stopping any student that's not a third wave member from entering this room. I want you to remember and be able to recite by tomorrow the name and address of every third wave member. You are assigned to the problem of training and convincing at least 20 children in the adjacent elementary school that our sitting posture is necessary for better learning. It's your job to read this pamphlet and report its entire content to the class before the period ends. I want each of you to give me the name and address of one reliable friend that you think might want to join the third wave. To conclude the session on direct action, I instructed the students in a simple procedure for initiating new members. It went like this. A new member had only to be recommended by an existing member and issued a card by me. Upon receiving this card, the new member had to demonstrate knowledge of our rules and pledge obedience to them. My announcement unleashed a fervor. The school was alive with conjecture and curiosity. It affected everyone. The school cook asked what a third wave cookie looked like. I said, chocolate chip, of course. Our principal came into an afternoon faculty meeting and gave me the third wave salute. I saluted back. The librarian thanked me for the 30-foot banner on learning which she placed above the library entrance. By the end of the day, over 200 students were admitted to the order. I felt very alone and a little scared. Most of my fear emanated from the incidents of tattletaling. Though I formally appointed only 3 students to report deviant behavior, approximately 20 students came to me with reports about how Alan didn't salute or Georgine was talking critically about our experiment. This incidence of monitoring meant that half the class now considered it their duty to observe and report on members of their class. Within this avalanche of reporting, one legitimate conspiracy did seem underway. 3 women in the class had told their parents all about our classroom activities. These 3 young women were by far the most intelligent students in the class. As friends, they chummed together, they possessed a silent confidence, and took pleasure in a school setting that gave them academic and leadership opportunity. During the days of the experiment, I was curious how they would respond to the equalitarian and physical reshaping of the class. The rewards they were accustomed to winning just didn't exist in the experiment. The intellectual skills of questioning and reasoning were non-existent. In the martial atmosphere of the class, they seemed stunned and pensive. Now that I look back, they appeared much like the child with a so-called learning disability. They watched the activities and participated in a mechanical fashion, whereas others jumped in, they held back, watching. In telling their parents of the experiment, they set up a brief chain of events. The rabbi for one of the parents called me at home. He was polite and condescending. I told him we were merely studying the German personality. He seemed delighted and told me not to worry. He would talk to the parents and calm their concern. In concluding this conversation, I envisioned similar conversations throughout history, in which the clergy accepted and apologized for untenable conditions. If only he would have raged in anger or simply investigated the situation, I could point the students to an example of righteous rebellion, but no. The rabbi became part of the experiment. In remaining ignorant of the oppression in the experiment, he became an accomplice and advocate. By the end of the third day, I was exhausted. I was tearing apart. The balance between role-playing and directed behavior became indistinguishable. Many of the students were completely into being third-wave members. They demanded strict obedience of the rules from other students and bullied those that took the experiment lightly. Others simply sunk into the activity and took self-assigned roles. I particularly remember Robert. Robert was big for his age and displayed very few academic skills. Oh, he tried harder than anyone I know to be successful. He handed in elaborate weekly reports copied word for word from the reference books in the library. Robert is like so many kids in school that don't excel or cause trouble. They aren't bright, they can't make the athletic teams, and they don't strike out for attention. They're lost, invisible. The only reason I came to know Robert at all is that I found him eating lunch in my classroom. He always ate lunch alone. Well, the third wave gave Robert a place in school. At least he was equal to everyone. He could do something, take part, be meaningful. That's just what Robert did. Late Wednesday afternoon, I found Robert following me and asked what in the world he was doing. He smiled, and I don't think I'd ever seen him smile, and announced, "Mr. Jones, I'm your bodyguard. I'm afraid something will happen to you. Can I do it, Mr. Jones, please?" Given that assurance and smile, I couldn't say no. I had a bodyguard. All day long, he opened and closed doors for me. He always walked on my right, just smiling and saluting other class members. He followed me everywhere. In the faculty room, closed to students, he stood at silent attention while I gulped some coffee. When accosted by an English teacher for being a student in the teacher's room, he just smiled and informed the faculty member that he wasn't a student, he was a bodyguard. Strength through pride. On Thursday, I began to draw the experiment to a conclusion. I was exhausted and worried. Many students were over the line. The third wave had become the center of their existence. I was in pretty bad shape myself. I was now acting instinctively as a dictator. Oh, I was benevolent. And I daily argued to myself on the benefits of the learning experience. By this, the fourth day of the experiment, I was beginning to lose my own arguments. As I spent more time playing the role, I had less time to remember its rational origins and purpose. I found myself sliding into the role even when it wasn't necessary. I wondered if this doesn't happen to lots of people. We get or take an ascribed role and then bend our life to fit the image. Soon the image is the only identity people will accept, so we become the image. The trouble with the situation and role I created was that I didn't have time to think where it was leading. Events were crushing around me. I worried for students doing things they would regret. I worried for myself. Once again, I faced the thoughts of closing the experiment or letting it go its own course. Both options were unworkable. If I stopped the experiment, a great number of students would be left hanging. They had committed themselves in front of their peers to radical behavior. Emotionally and psychologically, they had exposed themselves. If I suddenly jolted them back to classroom reality, I would face a confused student body for the remainder of the year. It would be too painful and demeaning for Robert and the students like him to be twisted back into a seat and told, it's just a game. They would likely take the ridicule from brighter students that participated in a measured and cautious way. I couldn't let the Roberts lose again. The other option of just letting the experiment run its course was also out of the question. Things were already getting out of control. Wednesday evening, someone had broken into the room and ransacked the place. I later found out it was the father of one of the students. He was a retired Air Force colonel who had spent time in a German prisoner of war camp. Upon hearing of our activity, he simply lost control late in the evening. He broke into the room and tore it apart. I found him that morning propped up against the classroom door. He told me about his friends that had been killed in Germany. He was holding on to me and shaking. In staccato words, he pleaded that I understand and help him get home. I called his wife and with the help of a neighbor walked him home. We spent hours later talking about what he felt and did. But from that moment on Thursday morning, I was more concerned with what might be happening at school. I was increasingly worried about how our activity was affecting the faculty and other students in the school. The third wave was disrupting normal learning. Students were cutting class to participate, and school counselors were begging to question every student in the class. The real Gestapo in the school was at work. Faced with this experiment exploding in 100 directions, I decided to try an old basketball strategy. When you're playing against all the odds, the best action is to try the unexpected. And that's what I did. By Thursday, the class had swollen in size to over 80 students. The only thing that allowed them all to fit was the enforced discipline of sitting in silence at attention. A strange calm is in effect when a room full of people sit in quiet observation and anticipation. It helped me approach them in a deliberate way. I talked about pride. Pride is more than banners or salutes. Pride is something no one can take from you. Pride is knowing you are the best. It can't be destroyed. In the midst of this crescendo, I abruptly changed and lowered my voice to announce the real reason for the third wave. In slow, methodic tone, I explained what was behind the third wave. The third wave isn't just an experiment or classroom activity. It is far more important than that. The third wave is a nationwide program to find students who are willing to fight for political change in this country. That's right. This activity that we've been doing has been practice for the real thing. Across country, teachers like myself have been recruiting and training a youth brigade capable of showing the nation a better society through discipline, community, pride, and action. If we can change the way that the school is run, we can change the way that factories, stores, universities, and all other institutions are run. You are a selected group of young people chosen to help in this cause. If you will stand up and display what you have learned in the past 4 days, we can change the destiny of this nation. We can bring it a new sense of order, community, pride, and action, a new purpose. Everything rests with you and your willingness to take a stand. To give validity to the seriousness of my words, I turned to the 3 women in the class whom I knew had questioned the third wave. I demanded that they leave the room. I explained why I acted and then assigned 4 guards to escort the women to the library and to restrain them from entering the class on Friday. Then, in dramatic style, I informed the class of a special noon rally to take place on Friday. This would be a rally for third wave members only. It was a wild gamble. I just kept talking, afraid that if I stopped, someone would laugh or ask a question and the grand scheme would dissolve in chaos. I explained how, at noon on Friday, a national candidate for president would announce the formation of a third-wave youth program. Simultaneous to this announcement, over 1,000 youth groups from every part of the country would stand up and display their support for such a movement. I confided that they were the students selected to represent their area. I also questioned if they could make a good showing because the press had been invited to record the event. No one laughed. There was not a murmur of resistance. Quite the contrary. A fevered pitch of excitement swelled across the room. We can do it! Should we wear white shirts? Can we bring friends? Mr. Jones, have you seen this advertisement in Time magazine? The clincher came quite by accident. It was a full-page color advertisement in the current issue of Time for some lumber products. The advertiser identified his product as the third wave. The advertisement proclaimed in big red, white, and blue letters, "The third wave is coming." Is this part of the campaign, Mr. Jones? Is it a code or something? Yes. Now listen carefully. It's all set for tomorrow. Be in the small auditorium 10 minutes before 12 o'clock. Be seated. Be ready to display the discipline, community, and pride you have learned. Don't talk to anyone about this. This rally is for members only. Strength through understanding. On Friday, the 3rd day of the exercise, I spent the early morning preparing the auditorium for the rally. At 11:30, students began to ant their way into the room. At first, a few scouting the way, and then more. Row after row began to fill. A hushed silence shrouded the room. Third-wave banners hung like clouds over the assembly. At 12 o'clock sharp, I closed the room and placed guards at each door. Several friends of mine, posing as reporters and photographers, began to interact with the crowd, taking pictures and jotting frantic descriptive notes. A group photograph was taken. Over 200 students were crammed into the room. Not a vacant seat could be found. The group seemed to be composed of students from many persuasions. There were athletes, the social prominents, the student leaders, the loners, the group of kids that always left school early, the bikers, the pseudo-hip, a few representatives of the school's Dadaist clique, and some students that hung out at the laundromat. The entire collection, however, looked like one force as they sat in perfect attention. Every person focusing on the TV set I had in front of the room. No one moved. The room was empty of sound. It was like we were all witness to a birth. The tension and anticipation was beyond belief. Before turning on the national press conference, which begins in 5 minutes, I want to demonstrate to the press the extent of our training. With that, I gave the salute, followed automatically by 200 arms stabbing a reply. I then said the words, "strength through discipline," followed by a repetitive chorus. We did this again and again. Each time the response was louder. The photographers were circling the ritual, snapping pictures, but by now they were ignored. I reiterated the importance of this event and asked once more for a show of allegiance. It was the last time I would ask anyone to recite. The room rocked with a guttural cry. Strength through discipline. It was 12:05. I turned off the lights in the room and walked quickly to the television set. The air in the room seemed to be drying up. It felt hard to breathe and even harder to talk. It was as if the climax of Shouting Souls had pushed everything out of the room. I switched the television set on. I was now standing next to the television, directly facing the room full of people. The machine came to life, producing a luminous field of phosphorus light. Robert was at my side. I whispered to him to watch closely and pay attention to the next few minutes. The only light in the room was coming from the television, and it played against the faces in the room. Eyes strained and pulled at the light, but the pattern didn't change. The room stayed deadly still, waiting. There was a mental tug-of-war between the people in the room and the television. The television won. The white glow of the test pattern didn't snap into the vision of a political candidate. It just whined on. Still, the viewers persisted. There must be a program. It must be coming on. Where is it? The trance with the television continued for what seemed like hours. It was 12:07. Nothing. A blank field of white. It's not going to happen. Anticipation turned to anxiety and then to frustration. Someone stood up and shouted, "There isn't any leader, is there?" Everyone turned in shock. First to the despondent student, and then back to the television. Their faces held looks of disbelief. In the confusion of the moment, I moved slowly towards the television. I turned it off. I felt air rush back into the room. The room remained in fixed silence. But for the first time, I could sense people breathing. Students were withdrawing their arms from behind their chairs. I expected a flood of questions, but instead got intense quietness. I began to talk. Every word seemed to be taken and absorbed. Listen closely. I have something to tell you. Sit down. There is no leader. There is no such thing as a national youth movement called the Third Wave. You have been used, manipulated, shoved by your own desires into the place you now find yourself. You are no better or worse than the German Nazis we've been studying. Oh, you thought you were the elect, that you were better than those outside this room. You bargained your freedom for the comfort of discipline and superiority. You chose to accept that group's will and the big lie over your own conviction. Oh, you think to yourself that you were just going along for the fun, that you could extricate yourself at any moment. But where were you heading? How far would you have gone? Let me show you your future. With that, I switched on a rear screen projector. It quickly illuminated a white drop cloth hanging behind the television. Large numbers appeared in a countdown. The roar of the Nuremberg rally blasted into vision. My heart was pounding. In ghostly images, the history of the Third Reich paraded into the room. The discipline, the march of superior race, the big lie, arrogance, violence, terror. People being pushed into vans, the visual stench of death camps, faces without eyes, the trials, the plea of ignorance. I was only doing my job. My job. As abruptly as it started, the film froze to halt on a single written frame. Everyone must accept the blame. No one can claim that they didn't, in some way, take part. The room stayed dark as the final footage of film flapped against the projector. I felt sick to my stomach. The room sweat and smelt like a locker room. No one moved. It was as if everyone wanted to dissect the moment, figure out what had happened. Like awakening from a dream and deep sleep, the entire room of people took one last look back into their consciousness. I waited for several minutes to let everyone catch up. Finally, questions began to emerge. All of the questions probed at imaginary situations and sought to discover the meaning of this event. In the still darkened room, I began the explanation. I confessed my feelings of sickness and remorse. I told the assembly that a full explanation would take quite a while, but to start, I sensed myself moving from an introspective participant in the event towards the role of teacher. It's easier being a teacher. In objective terms, I began to describe the past events. Through the experience of the past week, we have all tasted what it was like to live and act in Nazi Germany. We learned what it felt like to create a disciplined social environment, to build a special society, pledge allegiance to that society, replace reason with rules. Yes, we would have all made good Germans. We would have put on the uniform, turned our heads as our friends and neighbors were cursed and then persecuted, pulled the locks shut, worked in the defense plants, burned ideas. Yes, we know in a small way what it feels like to find a hero, to grab quick solution, feel strong and in control of destiny. We know the fear of being left out, the pleasure of doing something right and being rewarded, to be number one, to be right. Taken to an extreme, we have seen and perhaps felt what these actions will lead to. We each have witnessed something over the past week. We've seen that fascism is not just something those other people did. No, it's right here, in this room, in our own personal habits and way of life. Scratch the surface and it appears. Something in all of us. We carry it like a disease. The belief that human beings are basically evil and therefore unable to act well towards each other. A belief that demands a strong leader and discipline to preserve social order. And there is something else, the act of apology. This is the final lesson to be experienced. This last lesson is perhaps the one of greatest importance. This lesson was the question that started our plunge into studying Nazi life. Do you remember the question? It concerned a bewilderment at the German populace claiming ignorance and non-involvement with the Nazi movement. If I remember the question, it went something like this. How could the German soldier, teacher, railroad conductor, nurse, tax collector, the average citizen claim at the end of the Third Reich that they knew nothing of what was going on? How can a people be a part of something and then claim at the demise that they were not really involved? What causes people to blank out their own history? In the next few minutes and perhaps years, you will have an opportunity to answer this question. If our enactment of the fascist mentality is complete, not one of you will ever admit to being at this final third wave rally. Like the Germans, you will have trouble admitting to yourself that you came this far. You will not allow your friends and parents to know that you were willing to give up individual freedom and power for the dictates of order and unseen leaders. You can't admit to being manipulated, being a follower, to accepting the third wave as a way of life. You won't admit to participating in this madness. You will keep this day and this rally a secret. It's a secret I shall share with you. I took the film from the 3 cameras in the room and pulled the celluloid into the exposing light. The deed was concluded. The trial was over. The third wave had ended. I glanced over my shoulder. Robert was crying. Students slowly rose from their chairs and, without words, filed into the outdoor light. I walked over to Robert and threw my arms around him. Robert was sobbing, taking in large, uncontrollable gulps of air. It's over. It's all right. In our consoling each other, we became a rock in the stream of exiting students. Some swirled back momentarily to hold Robert and me. Others cried openly and then brushed away tears to carry on. Human beings circling and holding each other, moving towards the door and the world outside. For a week, in the middle of the school year, we had shared fully in life. And as predicted, we also shared a deep secret. In the 4 years I taught at Cubberley High School, no one ever admitted to attending the Third Wave rally. Oh, we talked and studied our actions intently, but the rally itself, no. It was something we all wanted to forget.
All right. Wow. It's pretty powerful stuff. I saw the special first, and it had a strong impact. Reading the original short story, from which details were then turned into the TV, I think brought it to life even more. People who went through this event, the students, are still alive and around today, as is the teacher, and they have been giving interviews about their experience. There's a documentary made by the students where they talk about some of the things that they experienced. And when they made that documentary, the teacher himself didn't realize the extent to which the students were engaging in this divisive and in some cases violent activities and actions outside of the classroom, to the point of violently assaulting journalists who wanted to report on what was going on, to those students, the young ladies who rejected it and didn't want to be a part of it. They had secretly put up posters saying that this third wave thing is dangerous and you need to revolt against it because it's a revolting organization. Those posters were torn down. And there was kind of an ideological battle taking place by the students of themselves. And so if you watch the documentary made by the student survivors in the 2000s, you can get some insight into how it's even deeper. Here we saw that you have a charismatic leader and students. And the charismatic leader sets up a framework of discipline, community, action, things that define what it means to be good and strong in your community. And the students who are vulnerable to wanting to feel good, if you remember what it was like in high school, all of those insecurities that you have as you're trying to develop into a full adult are there. You want to be accepted. You want to be good. And so your prime, that vulnerability is something which then gets exploited. And the teacher did exploit in this case. And this is why when you go and you study other groups, other cults, or other movements, you'll see that many times they target people in high school and in their early years in college, because that is the most destabilized part of your life. Because you're trying to differentiate yourself from your childhood and upbringing and your parents and create the adult that you will be, to take on your own worldview, your own values, independent of your parents. And so at that moment of vulnerability is where these groups have learned to strike so that they can bring you into their ideological prison. You see it in the proselytizing efforts of certain religions. You see it in political factions. And the unique thing about what we learn about the human psyche from events like this is that in order for this classroom to have these social forces take form, where the students are presented with an ideological framework of what it means to be good, and then they adopt it and start holding that lens to the world in their local community, that requires physical presence. It requires you to be in the classroom. There's an authority figure who gives you that framework, but you don't necessarily have to have that one authority figure. The dimension that you don't really see in this depiction is included in the German version of the wave. And that is that there's a teacher, I guess there's some special week where they learn about different systems of government. He is told he's going to teach about totalitarianism or authoritarianism. And so he does kind of the same thing. The German students are sick of learning about, Nazis and fascism, but he kind of gets them to go along with this experiment, even though they know it has to deal with fascism. But what he does is he creates an enemy. Now it's no longer about just being good and the framework of goodness, but you also have the enemy. And in his case, it's the other classes that are teaching other systems of government. So the one right below them is the anarchism class. And so, in doing those drills of standing and sitting, they also start stomping in a way to try to disrupt them. Because that dimension, there's this saying that you can have a cult or an ideology without a god. You can think of any political faction, and it can operate as a cult. But you can't have any movement like that without the devil, without an enemy. Because it's that enemy, it's the thing that you're fighting against that binds people together to give them that sense of goodness, because their goodness is the antithesis of that enemy. And so you could look at what happened in this version of The Wave when he talks about strength and discipline and community, and that goodness. You just take the opposite of whatever that is. So weakness, individualism rather than community, apathy rather than action. Those are all the bad things. But you can take that dimension into any other moral framework and see what it is that they demonize, because the opposite of what they demonize is what the sense of goodness that they give themselves by adopting the ideology. And usually it's done in a closed framework where you're not given the freedom to see any other definition of goodness. And when they describe these groups not as cults, but as totalistic ideologies, it's because that ideology takes control of your entire worldview and tells you this is the way that you must think in order to see yourself as good. And any thoughts, actions, or people that you would accept or internalize has to conform to this worldview, or else it is not good. Another important aspect of the totalizing character of these ideologies is that any action which would lead to more extreme or more intense expressions of the group intentions or perspective is considered good, and anything that would compromise or somehow step away from the purposes of the group according to their ideology is seen as bad or complicit in badness. As a result, actions tend to lead towards more and more radicalized perspectives, and participants in these ideologies find themselves down the road accepting and normalizing more extreme, more radical actions or beliefs than they would ever have considered at the beginning of it. And this is where the finale of the German version of The Wave is so powerful, because the teacher in this German version makes a point in his presentation about exactly where these ideologies lead to, in a way that draws back to the original question of whether or not another fascist state could arise in Germany. And again, remember, this is a parable for all of us. We're all subject to these different forces of social dynamics that can lead us into more radicalized belief, thought, and action. And so this is where I want to include that final scene, because he starts out kind of as a review of all of the good and powerful aspects of the movement that has been started in his project of The Wave. But then he does something when he's confronted with a student who stands up to dissent, and he draws the audience into the direct implications of what they're actually doing. Now, the finale of the German version is a little bit different, because one of the students who has clearly enmeshed his identity with the role that he plays in this project of The Wave is then confronted with an existential crisis when he learns that The Wave is just a lesson, a class project. It's not something that is real, that is going to continue. Then, because he has become so bound up in the ideology, he now sees himself as having no point of existence. At the beginning of the movie, he's kind of a wayward teen that is not really accepted or liked by a lot of people, but in the group, in the movement, he's found a great deal of acceptance and power. And so it's really bound up with his identity. You can see him as the Binky Barnes character in the
Arthur cartoon version of it, or as that bodyguard character in the original American version of The Wave. But when he's confronted with this existential crisis, he takes, again, a radical, extreme action that is just a reflection of how these ideological traps can lead you into more and more extreme actions being normalized and even considered appropriate or necessary. And they distort your sense of proportion and reality. And here is the finale of the German version of The Wave from 2008.
Eigentlich hatte ich immer alles, was ich wollte. Klamotten, Geld und so weiter. Doch was ich am meisten hatte, war Langeweile.
Es ist von mir.
Aber die letzten Tage haben richtig Spaß gemacht. Es geht nicht mehr darum, wer der oder die Schönste, die Beste und Erfolgreichste ist. Die Welle hat uns alle gleich gemacht. Herkunft, Religion und soziales Umfeld spielen keine Rolle mehr. Wir gehören alle einer Bewegung an. Die Welle gibt uns wieder eine Bedeutung. Ideale, für die es sich lohnt, einzustehen. Früher habe ich andere fertig gemacht. Wenn ich ehrlich darüber nachdenke, war das echt assi. Es ist viel besser, sich für eine gute Sache einzusetzen. Wenn sich jeder auf den anderen verlassen kann, erreichen wir so viel mehr. Dafür bin ich bereit, mich selbst zurückzunehmen. Wie ihr sicherlich alle gemerkt habt, sind das alles Auszüge aus euren Aufsätzen über die Erfahrung der letzten Woche. Ich bin sehr beeindruckt, was die Welle euch gebracht hat. Und deswegen bin ich auch der Meinung, dieses Projekt darf nicht einfach so enden.
Na, was soll der Scheiß?
Marco, setz dich hin.
Ja, aber Mann, die Leute denken...
Ich habe gesagt, du sollst dich hinsetzen. Seit Jahren geht es mit Deutschland bergab. Wir sind die Verlierer der Globalisierung. Aber die Politik will uns weismachen, dass immer mehr Leistung der einzige Weg aus der Krise ist. Aber Politiker sind nur Marionetten der Wirtschaft. Die Arbeitslosenquote soll sinken. Wir sind auch noch Exportweltmeister. Aber in Wirklichkeit ist es doch so, die Armen werden immer ärmer und die Reichen immer reicher. Die einzig große Bedrohung ist der Terror. Ein Terror, den wir selbst geschaffen haben. Durch die Ungerechtigkeit auf der Welt, die wir zulassen. Und während wir langsam aber sicher unseren Planeten zugrunde richten, sitzen da irgendwelche Superreiche und reiben sich die Hände, bauen Raumkapseln und gucken sich das Ganze auch noch von oben an.
Seht ihr denn nicht, was der vorhat? Der will euch alle manipulieren. Marco, jetzt ist gut, setz dich hin.
Du wirst mich nicht daran hindern, dass ich hier die Wahrheit sage, Marco.
Die Welle ist das eigentliche Problem.
Nein, die Welle ist der einzige Weg, dieser Entwicklung entgegenzutreten. Denn gemeinsam können wir alles schaffen. Wir haben hier heute die Möglichkeit, Geschichte zu schreiben. Deine Freundin hat dich gegen uns aufgehetzt. Das ist dein Problem.
Das ist nicht wahr.
Natürlich ist das wahr. Sie hat dich doch mit ihrem Scheiß komplett infiziert.
Du wirst uns nicht aufhalten. Von hier aus wird die Welle ganz Deutschland überrollen. Und wer sich uns in den Weg stellt, der wird von der Welle platt gemacht. Wie siehst du? Bring mir den Verräter nach vorne! Auf mit ihm! Sprich nur auf die Schweine! Marco, ich frag dich jetzt hier vor allen.
Lass mich.
Bist du für uns oder gegen uns?
Seid ihr jetzt komplett durchgedreht oder was?
Was machen wir jetzt mit dem Verräter? Hä? Was sollen wir mit dem Verräter machen? Bamba, sag du. Na los, sag! Du hast ihn doch auch hier hochgebracht.
Ja klar, weil sie es gesagt haben.
Ach, weil ich es gesagt habe, ja? Und würdest du ihn auch töten, wenn ich es dir sage? Wir können ihn ja auch erhängen oder enthaupten. Oder vielleicht foltern wir ihn, dass er sich zu unseren Regeln bekennt. Sowas macht man nämlich in einer Diktatur. Habt ihr gemerkt, was hier gerade passiert ist? Alles okay, Marco?
Ja, alles klar.
Könnt ihr euch noch erinnern, was für eine Frage letzte Woche im Raum stand? Ob sowas wie eine Diktatur bei uns noch möglich ist? Das war genau das. Faschismus. Wir alle haben uns für was Besseres gehalten. Besser als alle anderen. Und was noch viel schlimmer ist, wir haben alle, die nicht unserer Meinung waren, aus unserer Gemeinschaft ausgeschlossen. Wir haben sie verletzt. Und ich will nicht wissen, zu was wir noch alles fähig gewesen wären. Ich muss mich bei euch entschuldigen. Wir sind zu weit gegangen. Ich bin zu weit gegangen. Die Sache ist hier zu Ende.
Und was heißt es jetzt? Für die Welle.
Dass es vorbei ist.
Einfach so.
Ja, einfach so.
Nein, das ist nicht vorbei.
Doch, Tim, es ist vorbei.
Aber nicht alles an der Welle ist schlecht. Wir haben es doch alle gespürt. Ja, wir haben Fehler gemacht, aber die können wir korrigieren.
Nein, Dennis. Sowas kann man nicht korrigieren. Ich will, dass ihr jetzt alle nach Hause geht. Es gibt sicherlich genug, worüber ihr nachdenken müsst. Danke dir.
Maja, ich...
Lass mich.
Halt! Alle bleiben sitzen und die Türen zu! Keiner geht nach Hause!
Leg die Waffe weg.
Sie haben uns belogen. Die Welle lebt. Die ist nicht tot. Sagen Sie es. Die Welle lebt!
Das ist doch nur eine Gaspistole.
Ja? Jetzt nimmst du mich ernst. Denkst du, ich weiß nicht, dass du mich immer verarscht hast? Wie ihr mich verarscht habt! Die Welle... Das war mein Leben.
Tim, ganz ruhig. Ganz ruhig. Leg die Waffe weg.
Noch einen Schritt weiter und ich schieße ihn ins Gesicht.
Und dann? Was ist dann? Dann gibt's keinen Erwänger mehr, der deine Welle anführen kann. Ist es das, was du willst?
So that was the power of that German version of it. Now, where we get to the Netflix series called We Are the Wave, this is where I think we've gotten the most insightful version. Because remember, in these first two things, you had to physically be in the location where this ideology was being indoctrinated. If you go and watch the Netflix series We Are the Wave, what you've got is a bunch of students, each of whom has their own grievance, whether it is the destruction of the environment, racism, war, weapons of mass destruction. As young people learning about the world, we learn about the evils of the world, and that starts to shape our framework of what it means to be good. And now suddenly we live in a world where you can connect with other people and share that sense of goodness by the internet and social media. No longer does it require physical presence in a classroom. And not only that, but we're given ideas in the movies and the books and the medias that we give about the extent to which we can carry this framework of what it means to be good and what it means to be bad. And in all of these things, the students start acting on their own, and they start taking activist actions, taking their understanding of what good and bad is, and doing kind of social media events where they record themselves with certain hashtags, and they hashtag the wave of it. And more people draw in because they don't necessarily have to have an authoritarian figure as much as they have to have the moral framework.
Ultimately, what the show is really good at is showing the gradual descent into radicalism and extremism from idealistic young people who adopt a utopian vision of how the world should be, and all of the psychological mechanisms that end up reinforcing more and more extreme actions until they lose a sense of who they were as they transition into these extreme, radical, ideological activists.
When you take it to an extreme and you don't allow any other way of interpreting events or understanding the complexities of our reality other than the simplistic, binary, black and white view of these moral issues, then you start to subvert any other value that you have, whether or not violence is good, whether or not freedom of speech is important. All of those things become secondary to these black and white concepts of good and bad. And so you can see how those social forces then interplay with the same human vulnerabilities that took place in the classroom, only now it takes place at the connection between each individual and their smartphone, or each individual and their computer. So you start to make sense then of what is being called cancel culture. You know, before, when you had to be at the classroom and you could put up the flyer on the locker of the person who didn't join and didn't make the hand salute. Well, now you can call for mob activities, label them as bad in that rigid, binary, black and white moral framework that you've adopted. And then it justifies any consequence that they may have in their world. Demonizing even people who would, even though they hold the same principles, like we saw in the first one, where the brain still loved his school. He just didn't think you had to join a group or make a hand sign in order to do it. That in itself was worthy of getting him labeled as an outsider and as on the wrong side of history. So you've got then a way to make sense of things that we're seeing in our modern culture. So if you were paying attention in the last year, you probably encountered this video. So what you saw there was a woman sitting at a diner when a mob of Black Lives Matters protesters march through the streets and confront the diners, try to get people to raise their fist in solidarity with their movement. And this woman in a pink shirt does not do it. And then they see someone who doesn't go along with it, who doesn't raise their fist, and they all gather around her and start shouting at her. And you can see that the same social forces that we saw depicted in the Arthur cartoon are here being on display in the streets in modern times. And it's not a question of whether or not Black lives matter. It's a question of how we want our society to operate, whether we are able to tolerate different perspectives. And if you listen, this particular link is a Washington Post editorial where that woman in the pink shirt talks about why she didn't raise her fist. And she observes that she had attended past Black Lives Matter protests in support of the movement. This is in the wake of the death of George Floyd. She believes in the principle of Black Lives Matter, but she doesn't agree with the idea that coercive violence and shallow slogans in the face of fear of the social consequences of non-compliance is the way that we should shape our society moving forward. Because you see the same things that rip apart communities in Arthur's school system, where these people who could live in harmony, when they adopted these rigid ideological lines that broke the world into us versus them in a very binary moral framework of black and white thinking, that it tore apart the community of the school. And when you see that projected into our broad society and the issues that we face today, it has the same power to tear things apart. There's a great diversity of thought in the ways that we can confront the moral issues of things like racism and other social issues. But when you allow a certain ideology to dominate any other way of thinking and call out any other way of approaching that issue, then you start tapping into our human vulnerabilities, which make us either the ones holding up the fist or the ones sitting and being shouted at. And it's a very divisive thing. And while you're there holding up the fist and in the thrill of the mob action centered around what you have come to believe is right, the right way to be, you can feel elation. You're doing the right thing. And when you break apart from cultural and societal norms to do that right thing, it can almost feel like you are extending the great moral victories of the past. You're acting in the same thread as Martin Luther King and those people in the civil rights movement. But are you? It's really valuable to be aware of how our psychology can feed into the way that we intersect with these groups. We talked a little bit about how cults, studying cults and how cults work is almost a misdirection. It's like a lot of energy gets spent on focusing on the wrong thing. And you can take the parallel to this to be how things like the Defense Department handles like cybersecurity. Okay, there's no way for the Defense Department or for any institution to know every single type of attack that could come against them. There is some value in seeing what historically has been done. But an even more important exercise is for these institutions to identify and understand their own vulnerabilities, because any effective attack is going to demonstrate a vulnerability. And it's through understanding our vulnerabilities that we can then guard against future incursions, no matter what shape that they take from. And true, there may be a future attack that exploits a vulnerability that we didn't know about before. But in understanding that type of attack, we learn about a new vulnerability that we can guard against for things in the same way. So understanding human vulnerabilities is among the most important things that you can do as you unplug your mind from whatever coercive group that you've found yourself trapped in, whether it's Mormonism or whether it's a political group. Our entire understanding of the way psychology plays into these group ideologies was started by a psychologist researcher named Robert Lifton. And this is in the wake of the Cultural Communist Revolution of China. And there were people who spent time in prison under intense indoctrination who themselves survived the type of cultural revolution that happened in China. And again, the slogans that they had then spoke about good things, about greatness, about rising up to show what the Chinese people were capable of as they looked out for social justice and for all the different good principles. But it was done through this lens of a totalistic ideology that plied into the type of group and mob actions that we see take place when any simplistic black and white us versus them ideology starts to shape your moral worldview. And so there was a book that he wrote after talking to all of these survivors from these Chinese prisoners, and he learned about the ways that the agents of the Chinese Cultural Revolution exploited these human vulnerabilities to do what they called brainwashing, or what people in the wake of his book called brainwashing. But as people have started to understand, it's the ways that our psychological vulnerabilities interact in these social environments with these moral frameworks that causes us to be vulnerable to accepting and internalizing these ideologies, and thus distorting our own personal values in the way that we then operate in the world. People who've gone on to study and expand on the research that Robert Lifton has done have looked at many different facets of society where these things operate. There's another researcher, Janja Illich. She's another cult researcher who got her own experience as a member of a socialist, communist, revolutionary political faction in America. And it was in her journey out of that she started to understand how it worked, and she dedicated her life to research and understanding how our minds are vulnerable to those things. Because the more people that become aware of the red flags of people that exploit these vulnerabilities, the more we can avoid getting sucked into them. And the problem is, as we focus only on past cults and past movements, we may be blind to the way that these human vulnerabilities can play out in modern technologies. Whereas before we had to have an institution or a charismatic individual stand at the head of the classroom and impart these things, now we see that can be spread out through the matrix of social media. And it doesn't even require a charismatic individual or an organized religion. We see some expression of this in things like the flat earthers. There's not one specific flat earth commissar who's the one who gives all of the indoctrination and teachings about flat earth, and yet there's a broad network of flat earthers. There's QAnon, who has this anonymous sort of leader, but the leader doesn't even have to do anything. I think the main thing I wanted to get across in today's episode is just kind of the principle that you can only go so far trying to understand how cults work and how coercive group works. And when you shift your focus then to seeing how each of those things manifest our own psychological vulnerabilities, then you really are more prepared to identify and confront those things as they appear in whatever form and shape they may take. Now, I've got this document called the Glossary of Undue Influence that is on the website. And in it, with the help of Luna Lindsay, at the time Luna Corbden now, identified a bunch of different methods that cults and coercive groups use to get you to internalize their own ideological frameworks, shape the way that you view yourself and the way that you view others. And the thing is, you can look at each of these things through the lens of this is what the group does, and you'll learn something, and perhaps you'll be able to identify other groups who do the exact same thing. But you can also look at each of these items and ask yourself the question, what normal human vulnerability does this particular manipulation exploit? Is it our need to see ourselves as special and as good? Is it our need to see ourselves as whole and integral and consistent so that if we say something publicly, then we now have a psychological force to act it out? Is it our desire to have a sense of belonging? Is it our desire to be able to simply categorize things in the world as good or bad so that we can find ourselves on the side of good? When you ask yourself, what is the human vulnerability that these things exploit, it gives you a different understanding of how to analyze different groups and different movements that you may encounter. And so we find ourselves in a social environment now where people complain that there's this thing called cancel culture and that there are certain things that you're not allowed to say. And people will push back against that and say, well, you just want to be able to say racist or phobic things. And so you're just complaining that you can't be racist and you can't be bad. That type of response is a reflection of this very rigid black and white thinking where there's only one way to address our social problems the right way, and there's only one way to look at issues. And so if somebody says, well, I agree that Black Lives Matter, but there's a different approach that I want to take because I don't want to find myself moving to the second conclusion, which is that all white people are racist. Or you could find another person that says, well, I agree that trans people are real and that they deserve every human dignity and right. But I don't agree with the way that their search for their rights is impinging upon other people's rights. Those types of nuanced conversations are not allowed because people are shoved into this black and white way of thinking of the world where you have to think one way, absolutely, and adopt the specific ideology, or else you are a bigot. And that's where you really struggle, because right now you have things like the woman in the street that's getting confronted and mobbed, and people don't speak up and talk about those things. And the odd thing is, it's not even the groups that you would expect, because you can find black people who are very interested in making progress on social issues around racism, who don't agree with all of the ideological foundations that go along with the political movement of Black Lives Matter. And you can find actual individual trans people themselves who don't agree with all of the philosophical assertions that have been included in queer theory with trans ideology. But because that conversation is not allowed to happen because we immediately move to the demonization of anyone who has a different idea, then we aren't allowed to explore these ideas and find out which ones are consistent with a pluralistic society where we value diversity, not just of people, but of thought and ideas, and we respect people's ability to be able to talk about these things. Anyway, all right, so that is the sermon for today. It's not a sermon, it's just the episodes show up every once in a while just based on what's been going on in my brain and what I feel like. So with that said, let me see if you are interested in giving any thoughts that you might have on today's episode. You can call 210-422-2222. Let's see, Max Junction says, the cancel culture we have in America appears to have implemented the third wave mentality, and the Mormon Church does this as well. I think the lesson here is that that type of silencing of dissenting views is almost just a very predictable and natural extension of adopting a totalizing moral framework that looks at the world as us versus them, black and white, good and bad. It's a really hard thing to break out from because it requires you to allow other people to think differently. And when you've drawn the conclusion that your way of thinking is right and good to the exclusion of any other way of thinking, then suddenly anyone who thinks any other way you see as oppressive and a draw on our society and culture. And so it's really hard to avoid. And you kind of have to see the examples of it gone haywire in order for you to understand it. And that's what's so valuable about reading things like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's account of the atrocities that went on as the Russian communists took over power. That's why I found a great deal of insight in the story We the Living by Ayn Rand. Everybody loves to hate on Ayn Rand for The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but those are not as powerful as her autobiographical account of what it was like to live in that post-communist Russia. All right, so you are on Talk on Things and Stuff. I hope the audience can hear you, but what's on your mind?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that the video about the third wave is incredible. I'm so glad you brought a little more, brought that to light. I think it's so powerful because it is true that this summer I have questions about. Actually, I'm somebody who has been a long supporter of certain sorts of reform along racism, but yet there were things and concerns I had about Black Lives Matter, and I was terrified to say anything against the group, to raise questions. So I think this is a really interesting topic, and I really struggled because I'm somebody who generally likes to speak up, but I didn't want to get canceled. So I think it's a really powerful topic.
Yeah, and it's scary even for me to mention these things. And you can, if you go back and watch this, you can see that I'm trying to be intentionally broad in my language early on because there is a psychological trigger that happens now because, these forces are so powerful that even now we hesitate to use these words that are demonized if you don't accept them part and parcel. And there's a power in the way that these issues are framed, where I think particularly Black Lives Matter is effective because as a statement independent of any other ideology or political faction, it's something we can all agree with. But when you examine the political movement that has been attached to that sentiment, then there are things that many people might not agree with, including Black people. But when the moral lens is attached to it, where you now start to see anyone that disagrees with the totality of it is themselves now complicit in racism, and you start to look at the world as black and white, us versus them, either all in or all out, that's where we start seeing that these very human psychological forces start to take play, and they inevitably tend to rip apart societies because it's impossible to live together and to work together in a pluralistic society that respects individual diversity of thought when you put that black and white framework over it.
Right, and I agree with you. It's more than just Black Lives Matter was just one example. I think we could see it in politics and so many other places where you almost can't raise a question. So, I what do you think our best way of trying to combat this is? Obviously in the video I got the sense that you were recognizing this, seeing how the dynamics work. Is it just through education, or what do you think the best way to combat this type of groupthink? Because I think you see it on all kinds of sides and places, and you just can't talk to people about. It's just all or nothing, and that's what was really hard in a couple of different things.
The thing that's interesting about all of these stories is they start out with good things. Whether it's Arthur and the pride of Lakewood taking pride in your school, or just wanting to have some discipline and community, or being really concerned about imbalances and disenfranchisement that are racially motivated in society. Like, all those things are really good things to be concerned about. And in general, most people are concerned about those things. It's just, how do we move forward for it? I think education is important, particularly understanding how social movements with moral foundations can go wrong, and revisiting and trying to understand what are the ways that we've been able to make progress in the past. The concept that we allow people freedom of speech and freedom of ideas, and we confront bad ideas through rational discussion and debate, allowing people to say reprehensible things so that we can respond in the form of education and discussion, and in some cases, learning ourselves how to confront bad ideas better. And in some cases, we may have adopted unknowingly a way of looking at the world that demonizes any other way. And then when we confront those things, we may learn something that those other ideas aren't bad. I think anyone that's come out of Mormonism understands that, because we were told that the Tanners were evil, or we were told that people would try to, rip our faith by feeding us lies, or that any other way of living other than following the prophet was going to take you to hell. And when we confronted, we saw that the reality we lived in was not what it seemed. And so you still have to keep that open mind, even on things that we feel like we've already know and understand. We, coming out of the church, have had to completely reformulate our moral prism that we look at issues like LGBT issues. And a lot of what you can learn is that there are foundations in how to approach those issues that are completely divergent and antithetical to each other. So you can look at a way of approaching those issues that's founded on something called classical liberalism, which respects individual preference and priority, and also respects objective approach to reality and science. And you can divide that from something called queer theory, which takes a completely different philosophical approach to these issues and does it centered around group identity and social constructivism, which constructs reality as hegemonic forces that are implemented by the way that we talk about things. Those are different frameworks in which to address these issues. And if somebody from a classical liberal framework interacts with somebody with a queer theory, critical theory framework, then part of the weaponry is for the critical theory perspective to label the classical liberal perspective as homophobic or transphobic and to demonize them. And we're all afraid of repeating the sins of the past in how gay, lesbian, and trans people were treated as our society went through accepting those realities. But there are ways of approaching these issues that are going to cause more division and more strife because they end up completely reshaping how we construct our reality because they are fundamentally different. But you don't really understand that until you take the time. You have to learn like French philosophers like Michel Foucault and Derrida. You actually have to learn how they started describing the world in not in objective, testable terms, but in assertions that were based on their own personal philosophy rather than on objective, repeatable science, and how people built on that. It's taken me a long time, and I still don't have a complete grasp of it, but I do understand enough of it to see that there's a very fundamental difference in your approach to that. So education is a big part of being able to interact with people. And at some point, you have to lose your fear of being labeled a bigot. We have some people who have been able to do this, and generally the first ones are going to be people who are somewhat immune to it. So you can find people who are black who disagree with Black Lives Matter and disagree with it on philosophical terms, not political terms. So while some people may discard people like Candace Owen because she's aligned with political conservatism, you can find people who themselves are liberal progressives who don't agree with the way that they're trying to advocate for change. And when you listen to them and their reasons, you can decide which one is going to be more conducive to the way that we want to move together as a society. And I think as long as we're willing to listen to each other and to approach these issues, giving each other the benefit of the doubt that we're all working towards something good that we believe in, that's going to be a better foundation. I don't want to say that either side should be silenced and shouldn't be allowed to make their case. It's just that we have to exist in a society where we listen to each other.
Yeah, that's that's the hard thing. I think we're in social media. Social media is kind of a whole nother topic about this, but I think social media has allowed people to say to put all this stuff out here, and we're not. It's difficult to hold so many differing ideas. It's all out there on social media in a way that maybe it wasn't before. Yeah,
and it feeds into this idea that we get demonized, I think, by people in the church. It happened in the Fair Mormon videos recently where they say, well, when you leave the church, suddenly all truth is relative, which means that there are no absolute morals. And it's just not true, but it's tempting to make that argument when you see that people can make whatever argument that they want to on the internet. It's just the fact that now there's, we have mob action and cancel culture on top of our social media platform technologies themselves becoming aligned with particular ideologies so that they shut down any ability to discuss it. It really hurts us as a society.
Yeah. One thought that I had in regards to that was just all of the what I consider, for me, disinformation about COVID over the last couple months. And some of that discussion was being censored on Facebook. And I was really torn about that because on the one hand, my background is chemistry. I'm in healthcare, and some of that just seemed blatantly wrong and false, and provably so. But at the same time, I really thought when things were censored on Facebook, that closed down the discussion, and it just made things worse.
Yeah. Well, and I think just people getting brave enough to talk about these things is going to have to break the ice. We're going to have to normalize the ability to discuss these difficult issues without resorting to ad hominem, because rather than trying to understand someone, you simply label them a bigot. You're engaging in ad hominem. You're shutting down your ability to engage in it, and it's not doing you any good. It's not doing society any good. And so we just got to start being brave. It's hard to be brave. I haven't talked about this for a long time because I wanted to make sure that I understood it. And I think starting with these examples of where these ideological frameworks can be taken to their extreme is important, just so that we can make sure we avoid going there.
Right. Yeah. No, I think the examples you picked were beautiful because there in none of them was the other side evil or malicious or anything. They were just the other side. They were just another view. And that's what I think if you sit down and talk to people, you really find you have so much more in common, and maybe you disagree on a method. But, yeah, great examples. Thanks for the show.
All right. Thanks for the call. Take care. Okay. So if you'd like to join the conversation, 210-422-2222. Let's see here. So coercive groups, cancel culture, the us versus them that happens in groups. You can see it in Trump, BLM, politics, religions, even sports teams. I think one of the things when you look into these psychological vulnerabilities, you do have to draw a line at some point, because we engage and we tinker around with some of these things in every facet of our existence. The people that you choose to be friends with versus the people that you avoid, it's always there. It becomes dangerous when it starts taking over any other values that you have in a way that doesn't really give you the freedom to escape it. The question our last caller came up of what can we do? A big part for me of understanding the different sides of issues like Black Lives Matter or trans rights is listening to the people who are the activists who are trying to present the BLM and the trans rights side of things, and trying to understand that completely and give them absolute benefit of the doubt. They are trying to do something that is good. Whether it's from your perspective or their perspective, I think starting with a very human and empathetic perspective of that. Then the next thing that you do is you talk to people who used to be in that movement but have now left it, and ask them what it's like being in the movement. What was it like being in the third wave? And ask, because you can Google detransitioners and you can Google people who themselves are trans but don't look at gender through the social gender constructivist queer theory perspective of things. They still absolutely agree that trans people exist and that they are deserving of every right, but there's important philosophical differences in how that gets expression in society. So listen to the perspectives of people who have been in this movement, who have every reason to benefit from this movement, but choose not to be in the movement. And that's where you can really start to understand that it's not as simple as, you either agree with us, say the slogan, raise the fist, or you are a bigot and a bad person. There are complexities abound, and you can listen to all these perspectives and start to have some greater confidence in your own perspective, knowing that you're not alone and knowing that you've taken the time to really try to understand the issue and exist in a world where we have to confront these issues. Okay, Bob Peck brings up a comment. Calling it combat has already derailed understanding. We have to find another way to communicate, active listening and seeking deep understanding. And I completely agree with this. Combat and war and Helaman's army and all these other things, God's army, all of these things infuse a combative, confrontational theme to it. Even framing something like, let's get together and debate. That in and of itself has a combative theme to it. And this is where, if you're engaging in conversations on social media or in your personal life, and you frame it that way, let's have a fight, let's have a debate, then neither side is really going to be open to listening to each other. But if you frame it instead as, let's have a dialogue, where both of us are trying to understand each other's perspectives and come away with a greater understanding, then you're going to be able to go further in digging down to some of the, foundational premises and ideas that go along with any of these social movements. And hopefully you will have the ability to connect with the people in a way that they'll start to see your own humanity, and they won't start to see you through the black and white lens of you're either all in or all out. And it's something we all struggle with, so don't think that it's going to be easy. So I think we'll go ahead and close it down until next time. This has been Talk on Things and Stuff, and I'll see you again in a few days, hopefully. We'll see how it goes.